Arthur Prescott was a ghost, haunting his own life. The year was 1881, and his world was just a patch of dirt in Wyoming that God himself had forgotten. The wind howled a lonely song, and the sky was too big, too empty. It pressed down on him. The ground gave him rocks, not crops. The few cattle he had left looked as tired as he felt. Every winter, another one gone. Every mistake, another loss. He was a man hollowed out. The laughter of his wife, Martha, was an echo in the silent cabin. The weight of his baby son, gone too soon, was a phantom limb he could still feel. Grief wasn't a feeling. It was a physical thing. It was the ache in his ribs that never went away. It was the dead look in his eyes when he saw his own reflection. He moved through the days like a machine. Chop wood, mend fence, check snares, boil coffee. The routine was the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing him whole. The silence in his cabin used to be comfortable, a quiet space he shared with Martha. Now it was a monster. It was thick and heavy, and it was choking him. He hated the nearby town of Redemption, a fitting name for a place that offered him none. The people there looked at him with eyes full of pity and judgment. To them, he was the man who couldn't keep his family alive, the failure on the edge of the prairie. Their pity felt worse than their scorn, so he kept his trips short. Salt, flour, bullets. His answers to their questions were as sharp and cold as a winter morning. He was an outsider, and he'd wrapped that loneliness around himself like a coat. He felt the same way about the Lakota. He saw them how the town saw him, as a threat, a shadow on the horizon. He'd hear the whispers in town, raids, fights, stories that fed the fear that was like currency on the frontier. He never got close, just silhouettes on a distant ridge as the sun went down. They were just another part of the wildness he was trying to beat back, another reason his rifle was always by the door. His life was just waiting for an end he was too stubborn to find himself. He worked until his body screamed and his mind was too numb to remember. He ate but didn't taste. He slept but didn't rest. Each day was a weight he had to lift. And then, on a blistering summer afternoon, everything shattered. He was tracking a stray cow, a dumb animal that always found the weak spot in his fence. The sun was a hammer on the back of his neck. The air smelled of hot dust and dead grass. The tracks led him down into a shallow ravine, a place of broken rock and thorny brush. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty, it was watching him. The air felt tight, like a wire about to snap. And that's when he heard it. A cry, not an animal, a child. It was sharp and terrified, and it was cut short. Then, a man's guttural laugh. Arthur froze. His hand went to the Colt peacemaker on his hip without him even thinking about it. He moved slow, using the rocks for cover, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He peered over a ledge. What he saw below lit a fire in his dead soul. A boy, no older than 10. He was Lakota, with long dark hair, and his face was a mix of pure terror and raw defiance. He was backed against a rock wall, holding a small, crude knife. It was nothing against the two men walking toward him. They were white men, filthy, unshaven, with the kind of eyes that enjoyed cruelty. They weren't settlers. They were vultures, the kind that picked at the bones of the world. A third man stood by their horses holding a bow. A strange weapon for a white man. It must have been stolen. "Look what we got here," one of them sneered, his voice like grinding rocks. "A little stray. Wonder what the chief would pay to get his boy back." The other one laughed, a mean, ugly sound. "Ain't gonna be nothing left to pay for by the time we're done." Arthur's mind was a whirlwind. This wasn't his fight. He had spent years avoiding this exact kind of trouble. The boy was Lakota, the enemy, the whispered threat. Getting involved was like kicking a hornet's nest. It would bring a world of pain down on his head, destroying the fragile little life he had left. The smart thing to do was to just back away, pretend he saw nothing. Let the brutal world be brutal. But then he saw the boy's eyes. They were wide with fear, sure, but underneath that fear was a fire. A fierce, desperate courage that hit Arthur like a physical blow. It reminded him of Martha, staring down her sickness with a strength that had left him in awe. In that single moment, the boy stopped being a Lakota. He stopped being a threat. He was just a kid cornered and alone. The hollow place inside Arthur, the part of him that had died with his family, suddenly ached with a pain so sharp it took his breath away. To turn his back now wasn't survival. It was a betrayal of the man he used to be, the man Martha had loved. With a quiet curse that was half prayer, Arthur drew his pistol. He didn't shout a warning. Men like this didn't deserve one. He aimed at the first man, the one with the ugly laugh, and he fired. The gunshot cracked through the silence, echoing off the ravine walls like thunder. The man grunted, a look of pure, stupid shock on his face. He stumbled back, clutching at a red flower blooming on his shoulder. The second man was fast. He spun, his hand flying to his own gun. Arthur fired again, kicking up dust at the man's feet, making him dive for cover behind a rock. That was all the opening the boy needed. He moved like a flash, scrambling up the rock face with the speed of a mountain cat. "Get him!" the wounded man roared, his voice thick with pain and fury. But Arthur hadn't accounted for the third man, the one with the bow. An arrow was already knocked. The bowstring twanged. A searing, white-hot pain tore through Arthur's left shoulder. The force of it threw him back against the rock. He grit his teeth against the agony, the whole world shrinking to a single point of fire. He raised his Colt again, his arm shaking, and fired at the archer. The shot went wide. He had to get to the boy. He pushed himself off the rock, ignoring the fire spreading through his shoulder and chest. He scrambled toward the boy, who was already halfway up the ravine wall. "Come on!" he yelled, the word torn from his throat. Another arrow flew. This one hit him square in the back, just to the right of his spine. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer. It drove the air from his lungs and sent him face first into the dust. Blackness and nausea washed over him. He fought it. He had to get up. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, his vision swimming. He could hear the men shouting, getting closer. He was a dead man. But the boy, Chayton, he hadn't run. He had stopped. He was looking down at Arthur, and the fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else, something fierce. He scrambled back down a few feet, grabbed a heavy, jagged rock, and threw it with all his might. It caught the second outlaw on the side of the head with a sickening crack. The man cried out and dropped to one knee, dazed and confused. That single act of courage, so small and so brave, gave Arthur a last surge of adrenaline. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, primal rage, and forced himself to his feet. He lunged at the archer, using his own body as a shield to protect the boy, and brought the heavy steel barrel of his pistol down hard on the man's head. The man dropped like a sack of rocks. The first outlaw, the one with the wounded shoulder, stared in disbelief. He looked at his two downed friends, then at the wild-eyed, bleeding man in front of him. He saw the look in Arthur's eyes. It was the look of a man who had already lost everything, who had nothing left to fear, and he knew it was the most dangerous look in the world. He backed away, turned, and ran. He scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, not even looking back. Silence fell again. It was broken only by Arthur's ragged, painful gasps for air and the low groans of the outlaw the boy had hit. Arthur swayed, the world tilting around him. He looked at the boy, who was just staring, his dark eyes wide and unreadable. Arthur tried to give him a nod, to tell him it was okay, but the world was spinning too fast. The archer on the ground stirred. Arthur knew he couldn't leave the boy here. Not with these men. They might wake up. The other one might come back. He gestured with his good arm. "Go," he rasped. "Run." He turned his back on the downed man, a deliberate act of protection, and started to push Chaitin up the rest of the way out of the ravine. And that's when the third arrow hit. It must have been the dazed outlaw, the one hit with the rock, getting off one last shot. It slammed into his lower back, near the first one. He felt a sickening crunch of bone. The pain was absolute. It was a white light that erased everything. His legs just gave out. He fell. His last conscious thought was a silent apology to Martha. He had failed again. He didn't know how long he was out. Consciousness came back in sharp, jagged pieces of pure agony. He was moving. Or rather, he was being moved. Small hands were pulling at his shirt, trying to drag his dead weight across the rocky ground. He managed to pry his eyes open. He saw Chaitin, his small face streaked with dirt and tears, straining with all his might to pull him by the arm. The boy was trying to save him. The sheer, impossible grit of this child lit a tiny spark in the cold darkness of Arthur's soul. He couldn't die here. He couldn't leave this kid alone. Those men could still be out there. He forced his body to obey, every muscle screaming in protest. He got his arms underneath him, then one leg. The world was a spinning vortex of pain. The shafts of the 2 arrows in his back ground against bone with every tiny movement. "My cabin," he gasped, the words tasting like blood. He pointed a trembling finger in the vague direction of his homestead. The journey was a waking nightmare. It was a timeless, hallucinatory crawl through a world made of pain. But Chaitin never left his side. The boy was a small, silent shadow, sometimes pulling, sometimes pushing, his little hands surprisingly strong. He became Arthur's anchor. The one solid thing in a sea of agony. They moved yard by agonizing yard. Arthur would lurch forward, fall, and Chaitin would be there, helping him back up. Their shared ordeal forged a bond between them, stronger than words, stronger than blood. By the time they finally stumbled into the clearing, the sun was a bloody smear on the horizon. The sky was turning a bruised purple. Arthur collapsed just inside the doorway of his cabin, the rough wooden floor cool against his feverish skin. The last of his strength was gone. He was nothing but a container for pain now. He could feel the hot, sticky blood soaking his back, the unnatural pressure of the arrow shafts deep inside him. He drifted. Time had no meaning. Through a delirious haze, he was dimly aware of the boy moving around the cabin. He heard the scrape of the water bucket. He felt a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. It was such a simple, kind act. It brought tears to his eyes. He tried to thank the boy, but only a dry croak came out. Later, he felt a blanket being draped over him. It was tucked in around him with a care that was so familiar it made his heart ache. In his fevered mind, the small, dark-haired boy became his own son, somehow grown and returned to him. He saw Martha's face in the shadows, her expression soft with concern. The ghosts that usually haunted him were now figures of comfort, beckoning him toward a peaceful darkness. He was dying. He knew it. And a strange sense of calm washed over him. He hadn't died alone in this empty cabin. He had died saving a life. It was a better end than he deserved. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. A sound pulled him back from the edge. It wasn't a sound from inside the cabin. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming from outside. The sound of many horses, not galloping but walking, their hooves muffled by the dry earth. For a terrifying second, he thought the outlaws had come back, that the one who ran had brought his friends. A cold dread, sharper than any arrow, cut through his fever. He forced his eyes open. Pale morning light was filtering through the single grimy window. The cabin was filled with a strange, weak glow. He tried to push himself up, to reach the rifle leaning against the wall. It looked a million miles away. A fresh wave of agony shot through him, and he fell back with a groan. Chaitin was at the window, peering through a small crack in the wooden frame. The boy's body was ramrod straight. He was tense. He turned and looked at Arthur, his eyes wide. But it wasn't fear for himself in those eyes. It was fear for Arthur. Arthur strained his ears. The thrumming had stopped. Now there was only silence, a heavy, pregnant silence that was more terrifying than any noise. And he knew. With a certainty that chilled him to the bone, he knew who was outside. It wasn't the outlaws. He twisted his head, ignoring the grinding protest from the arrows in his back, and looked through the open doorway. His cabin was surrounded, warriors on horseback. They formed a loose, silent circle around his home, their shapes stark against the pale dawn. They were Lakota. They sat on their ponies, perfectly still, their faces like stone, their eyes fixed on his small, vulnerable cabin. They held spears and bows, ready. This wasn't a social call. This was it. The very thing he had always feared. They had tracked the boy here. They had found him with a wounded white man. They would see the blood, see the state he was in, and they would assume the worst. They would think he had kidnapped the boy, that he had hurt him. The bitter irony was like poison in his throat. His one good act, his one moment of salvation, was going to be seen as an act of war. He had saved the chief's son only to be killed by the chief himself. He closed his eyes. A deep, profound weariness washed over him. He had no strength left to fight, no voice to try and explain. All he could do was lie on his floor and wait for the end he had only delayed the day before. He heard the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of moccasins on the dry ground. They were dismounting. They were coming for him. The cabin door, which had been left ajar, was pushed open wider. A man stood there, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the morning light. He wore the eagle feather headdress of a chief. His face was a stern, unreadable mask. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept the room, taking everything in with a chilling quickness. The overturned stool, the bloodstains on the floor, the pale, broken white man lying there, and finally his son, who was standing protectively near Arthur's head. This was the chief, Tashunka. Arthur braced himself. He met the chief's gaze, determined to show no fear. It was the only thing he had left. But the war cry never came. The killing blow never fell. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. Chayton ran forward, not away from Arthur, but toward his father. He began to speak, a torrent of rapid Lakota, his voice high and urgent. He pointed at Arthur. Then he gestured wildly back toward the ravine, mimicking a man shooting a bow, mimicking another man falling. He pointed at the arrow shafts still sticking out of Arthur's back, his small hands tracing their path. Then he pointed to himself, tapped his own chest, and made a gesture of safety, of being protected. He ran back to Arthur's side, placed a small hand on his uninjured shoulder, and looked up at his father with an expression of desperate appeal. Tashunka's stern face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Confusion? Re-evaluation? He took a deliberate, silent step into the cabin. 2 other warriors followed him inside. He knelt beside Arthur. His gaze fell on the arrows. Most settlers used rifles. Bows were the weapons of the tribes. But a warrior knows his own arrows. He knows the arrows of his friends, and he knows the arrows of his enemies. The chief reached out a hand, not to harm Arthur, but to examine the arrow. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed against the fletching of the one highest on Arthur's back. He studied the feathers, the way they were bound with sinew. He saw the distinctive black and white pattern, and his eyes narrowed. A flicker of recognition, a flash of cold fury. But it wasn't directed at Arthur. These were not Lakota arrows. They were not Cheyenne. They were not Crow. He knew this design. They belonged to a small, vicious band of renegades. White men and dispossessed natives who preyed on everyone, settler and native alike. They were scavengers known for their particular brand of brutality. and they were known for using these specific arrows, stolen from a tribe they had wiped out years ago. The chief looked from the arrow to his son. Then he looked back at the pale, sweat-soaked face of the man on the floor, and he finally understood. He saw not an attacker, but a shield. The wounds, all in the back, told the entire story. This man had turned his back to the danger. He had taken the arrows that were meant for his son. The entire story Tushunka had built in his mind, of abduction, of violence, of a righteous rescue, it all crumbled to dust. What he was looking at wasn't a crime. It was a sacrifice, an incomprehensible act of courage from a man he was prepared to kill, a man he would have called his enemy. Tushunka stood up. The silence in the cabin was so thick, Arthur could feel its weight. The chief turned and spoke a few quiet words in his language to the warriors behind him. One of them immediately turned and left the cabin, moving with a clear purpose. Then, Tushunka turned back and looked down at Arthur. And for the first time, Arthur saw the hardness in the chief's eyes soften. It was replaced by something he couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was deeper than that. It was respect, acknowledgement. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness. There was nothing to forgive. It was a gesture that acknowledged a debt. Arthur's world started to swim again, the edges blurring into gray. The relief was so immense, so completely unexpected, that it broke the last thread of his consciousness. As he slipped back into the darkness, the last thing he felt wasn't the threat of death. It was the strange, bewildering sensation of being safe. He woke up slowly, to a world of soft sounds and gentle hands. The fire in his back was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, throbbing ache, but it was distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He wasn't on the hard floor anymore. He was in his own bed. The lumpy mattress had never felt so good. The air smelled of herbs and clean linen. He opened his eyes. A woman was sitting on a stool beside his bed. She was older, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a neat braid. She met his gaze with calm, intelligent eyes. She was grinding herbs in a small stone bowl, her movements practiced and serene. When she saw he was awake, she offered a small, reassuring smile. She gestured toward his back, then held up a small leather pouch. It was a silent explanation. She had treated him. She had given him something for the pain. And then it hit him. The arrows were gone. They had been removed. The thought of how they'd done that made a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He was profoundly grateful he'd been unconscious for it. He tried to say thank you, but his throat was as dry as the plains in August. The woman, Winona, seemed to understand. She picked up a cup of water and held it to his lips, supporting his head with her free hand. The water was cool and clean. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Over the next few days, his cabin, once a fortress of solitude, became a quiet hub of activity. The Lakota didn't leave. They set up a small camp a respectful distance away, down by the creek in a grove of cottonwood trees. They didn't intrude, but their presence was a constant, comforting weight on the landscape. He realized they weren't just waiting. They were standing guard. They were protecting him. Protecting the man who had protected their chief's son. Winona became his constant caretaker. She cleaned and dressed his wounds every day, her touch firm but gentle. She brewed foul-smelling herbal teas that fought the fever and dulled the pain. They didn't speak the same language, but they communicated through gestures and expressions. A nod from her was high praise. A slight frown was a warning not to move so much. In her quiet competence, he found a peace he hadn't known for years. He was forced to be helpless, to accept aid, and in that surrender, the hard shell he had built around his heart began to crack. Chayton was his other regular visitor. The boy would appear at the door each morning like a silent sentinel. At first, he would just stand there and watch. Then, he grew bolder. He started coming inside, sitting on the floor by Arthur's bed. Sometimes he would carve a piece of wood with that same small knife from the ravine. Sometimes he would just watch Winona work. One afternoon, he brought Arthur a gift, a handful of wild berries, tart and sweet, held out in his small, cupped hands. Arthur took them, his own large, clumsy hand brushing against the boy's. He ate them one by one. The bright, sharp flavor was a shock after days of bland broth. He met the boy's eyes and managed a real smile. Chayton smiled back. It was a quick, brilliant flash of a grin that transformed his serious little face. It was the first time Arthur had ever seen him smile. It felt like the sun breaking through after a long storm. The warriors outside did more than just stand guard. He would hear them during the day, the sounds of quiet, purposeful work. The day he was finally strong enough for Winona to help him to the doorway, he saw what they had done. The section of fence the stray cow had broken, the very reason he'd been in that ravine in the first place, had been repaired. It was stronger than it was before, and a neat stack of firewood, perfectly cut and seasoned, was piled by his door. They were repaying the debt, not with words, but with actions. It was a language he understood perfectly. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Tashunka himself came to the cabin. He entered alone, and his presence seemed to fill the small room. Winona and Chayton slipped out respectfully, leaving the two men by themselves. Tashunka stood by the bed looking down at Arthur. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't awkward. It was a silence of mutual respect, of two men taking each other's measure. Finally, Tashunka spoke. He used a few English words, stitched together with gestures. "You fight," he said, touching his own chest, then pointing at Arthur. "Good heart." He then held up his hand, showing the 3 arrows his people had removed from Arthur's back. He laid them carefully on the blanket beside Arthur. Then he placed something else next to them. A single, perfect eagle feather. Its tip was dyed a deep blood red. It was a mark of the highest honor, a symbol of a life debt, paid in full. Arthur looked from the feather to the chief's proud, weathered face. He felt a lump forming in his throat. For years, he had seen these people as nothing more than a faceless threat, another part of the harsh wilderness that had taken everything from him. Now their leader stood in his home, honoring him. The prejudice he had carried for so long, a poison he'd absorbed from the fearful talk in town, suddenly felt like a fool's burden. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the feather, his fingers tracing its delicate shape. "Your son," Arthur said, his voice still rough from disuse. "He is brave." He pointed to his own heart. "He has a good heart." A rare smile touched Tashunka's lips. He understood. He placed a hand on his own chest, then on Arthur's. It was a gesture of shared fatherhood, of a bond that had been forged in violence and sealed in gratitude. Then, as silently as he had come, the chief turned and left. The next morning, at dawn, the tribe departed. Arthur watched from his bed as they broke camp, their movements efficient and graceful. They melted back into the landscape, as if they had never been there at all. They left behind only the repaired fence, the pile of wood, and a silence that no longer felt empty. Weeks turned into a month. Arthur slowly, painfully, got his strength back. The wounds on his back healed into thick, ropey scars, a permanent map of the day his life had been irrevocably changed. He moved with a new stiffness that would probably never leave him. But the hollowness inside him, the vast, empty space left by his grief, had started to fill. It was no longer an abyss of despair. It was being filled with the memory of unexpected kindness, of a boy's courage, and a chief's honor. He started working his land again, but things were different. The silence of his homestead wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful. The land, which had always felt like an enemy, now felt like a partner in his healing. He found he no longer looked at the horizon with fear. He looked with a quiet sense of anticipation. One cool autumn afternoon, as he was splitting wood, he felt it again. That familiar sensation of being watched. He looked up toward the low ridge that overlooked his property. A lone figure on a pony was standing there, a small silhouette against the vast blue sky. It was Chayton. The boy raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Arthur stopped what he was doing. He leaned his axe against the chopping block and raised his own hand in return. A smile, easy and unburdened, touched his lips. The boy was his guardian, his connection to a world he had never sought to understand. The grief for Martha and his son would always be there, a quiet ache under the surface of things. But it was no longer the whole story. He was no longer just the man who had lost everything. He was the man who had been given a second chance. Not by the suspicious folks in town, but by the very people he had been taught to fear. He was Arthur Prescott. He was the man with 3 scars on his back and an eagle feather on his mantle. And for the first time in a very long time, he was not alone. His home was no longer just a cabin on a desolate plot of land. It was a point on a map, connected by an invisible thread of honor and respect to a people who rode the wind. And as he picked up his axe and got back to work, the rhythmic thud of splitting wood sounded less like a chore and more like a heartbeat. Strong, steady, and alive. But the story doesn't end there. Because what Arthur didn't know was that the renegades who had attacked Chayton weren't just random thugs. And their attack wasn't random either. They were after something specific, something the boy was carrying, something Tashunka hadn't told him. A few more weeks passed. The air grew colder, and the first dustings of snow appeared on the high peaks. Arthur had settled into a new rhythm. He worked his land, he repaired his cabin, and every few days he would see the small figure of Chayton on the ridge, watching over him. Their silent waves became a ritual, a quiet conversation across the distance. One afternoon, however, was different. Chayton wasn't alone. Another figure on horseback was with him. As they drew closer, Arthur recognized the imposing figure of the chief, Tashunka. They rode right up to his cabin. Arthur put down his axe and waited. Tashunka dismounted, his face as serious as ever. "We need to talk," the chief said, his English clearer this time, as if he'd been practicing. He explained that the men who had attacked his son were part of a group led by a man named Silas Kane, a former army scout who had been dishonorably discharged and now led a pack of wolves, preying on anyone they saw as weak. But they weren't just after a ransom. Tashunka explained that Chayton had been returning from a pilgrimage to a sacred site. He was carrying a medicine pouch. It wasn't just a simple bag. It contained sacred objects, passed down through generations of healers in their tribe. It held the knowledge and power of his people. Silas Kane knew about the pouch. He had once tried to trade for it, then tried to steal it, believing it held some kind of magic that would make him powerful. He was obsessed. The attack in the ravine wasn't a kidnapping. It was a robbery, a desecration, and the man who had run away, the one with the wounded shoulder, had taken the pouch. Tashunka's tribe was now facing a crisis. Without the medicine pouch, they couldn't complete their winter ceremonies. It was a blow to their spirit, to their very culture. His warriors had been tracking Kane's gang, but the renegades were clever, and they had disappeared into the harsh, broken lands to the north. "My warriors are great trackers," Tashunka said, his voice heavy with frustration. "But Kane knows how the white man thinks, how he hides." He looked Arthur straight in the eye. "You know, you were a soldier once, yes?" Arthur was taken aback. He hadn't told anyone about his past. He had fought in the war, a lifetime ago, a part of his life he had buried deep. "How did you know?" he asked. Tashunka simply pointed at Arthur's scars. "Not just arrows," he said. "Older scars, a soldier's scars." He was right. Arthur carried more than just the wounds from the ravine. "We have tracked them to a place called Devil's Jaw. Tashunka continued. A canyon system. A maze. We know they are there. But to go in is a trap. Cain will be waiting. He was asking for help. Not for a fight, but for knowledge. For strategy. He was asking Arthur to think like his enemy. To see the world through the eyes of a white man like Silas Cain. The old Arthur, the man who wanted only to be left alone, would have said no. But that man was gone. He looked at Tashunka, at this proud chief asking for help. He looked toward the ridge where Chaitan sat on his pony, watching them. He owed these people his life. More than that, he owed them his soul. "Tell me about this canyon," Arthur said. For the next hour they spoke. Tashunka described the layout of Devil's Jaw, drawing maps in the dirt with a stick. Arthur listened, his mind, once foggy with grief, now sharp and clear. The old instincts, the tactical training he thought he had forgotten, came flooding back. He saw the traps, the ambush points, the likely places Cain would make his stand. He pointed to a narrow pass on the dirt map. "He'll expect you to come through here," Arthur explained. "He'll have men on the ridges. It's a shooting gallery." He drew another line, a longer, more difficult route around the back of the canyon. "But he won't expect you to climb. He'll think you're bound to your horses. If your men can scale this cliff face at night, they can come down on his camp from behind, while he's watching the front door." Tashunka studied the new route, his eyes narrowed in concentration. A slow smile spread across his face. It was a risky plan, a dangerous one, but it was a plan born of two worlds, combining Lakota skill with a soldier's cunning. It was a plan that might just work. "We will do this," the chief said, standing up. He placed his hand on Arthur's good shoulder. "You have a warrior's mind." That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He sat by his fire, the eagle feather on the mantel seeming to glow in the flickering light. He was no longer just a homesteader. He was part of something bigger now, a fight for justice, a fight for a people who had shown him more kindness than his own. The next days were a blur of waiting. The silence from the plains was heavy with unspoken questions. Did the plan work? Were they safe? Had he sent them into a trap? He found himself constantly scanning the horizon, waiting for a sign. Then, one afternoon, he saw a single rider approaching. It was Chaitan. The boy rode straight to the cabin, his face serious. He dismounted and walked up to Arthur. He was holding something. It was the stolen medicine pouch. It was safe. Chaitan held it out for Arthur to see, then clutched it to his chest. He looked up at Arthur, and for the second time, that brilliant, sun-breaking smile lit up his face. But that wasn't all he had. From his belt, he pulled a Colt Peacemaker, not Arthur's, but another one, its handle worn and grimy. He held it out to Arthur. It was the pistol from the outlaw in the ravine. The renegades had been defeated. Justice had been served. Arthur took the pistol. It felt heavy in his hand, a symbol of the end of a bloody chapter. He now had his own rifle, his original Colt, and this third gun, a trophy from a battle he had helped win from miles away. He looked at the boy, at the sacred pouch he held, and at the endless plains stretching out behind him. The invisible thread that connected his small cabin to the Lakota people had become a rope. Strong and unbreakable. He was no longer a ghost. He was a guardian, an ally, a friend. His world was no longer a small, failing homestead. It was as wide and as full of possibility as the Wyoming sky itself. He had found his redemption, not in a town, but in the heart of the very wilderness he had once feared. What do you think? Is it possible for two completely different cultures to find common ground through a single act of courage? The story of Arthur Prescott and the Lakota suggests it is. It shows that beneath our differences, a shared sense of honor, courage, and justice can build a bridge stronger than any wall of prejudice. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales of the unexpected. Let me know in the comments what you think Arthur did with that third pistol. Thanks for watching.